Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on the subject of ISO 45001. We're going to provide an overview of the changes between OSAS 18001-2007 and ISO 45001-2018. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. I have a brief agenda on the screen here on this slide. Today, I will begin the presentation with just a little bit of background about PJR, who we are, what we do. We will provide an overview of the benefits and drivers for a health and safety certification such as ISO 45001. We will cover the timeline information for clients who are currently certified to OSAS 18001 and will be migrating to 45001. We will then spend the bulk of the time covering the key changes of the standard, again, comparing those two standards, and provide a more detailed clause-by-clause overview, again, highlighting those changes. Towards the end of the presentation, I'll introduce a couple other related changes, some other documents that were published around the same time as ISO 45001 that affect health and safety certified clients. I will provide an overview of the certification process for anyone who is not migrating from OSAS 18001 to ISO 45001, but is instead pursuing certification to ISO 45001 for the first time. And we will close with questions. You can type them into the chat field or the question field at any point, but I will save them for the end. So Perry Johnson Registrars is one of the leading registrars in the world. We have clients that we certify to a variety of standards all around the world. This list is not all inclusive, but it certainly gives you an idea of our global presence as a registrar. And we are accredited to grant certifications to, as I said, a variety of standards. Today, we are focusing on ISO 45001. We have already achieved accreditation for ISO 45001 through UCAS, and we are currently pursuing accreditation through ANAB as well. Benefits and drivers for ISO 45001 certification include improvements to an organization's occupational health and safety performance, providing a safe environment in which to do business, minimizing the risk of production delays, driving improvements or increases in management commitment and employee engagement, the ability to meet legal and other requirements that the organization may be subject to, strategic business management benefits, including meeting stakeholder requirements, improving the organization's public image, and in some cases providing a competitive advantage over competitors who do not have a comparable certification to be able to advertise. This standard is able to be integrated with other business management systems. There are drivers related to supplier health and safety performance as well, so not just the organization, but also their suppliers in some cases. I already mentioned providing a competitive advantage and improving public image. Those can provide financial benefits, such as maybe achieving or winning bids that you might not without being able to advertise the certification. In some cases or in some areas, there may also be cost savings related to insurance premiums if you are maintaining a health and safety certification like ISO 45001. Okay, so at a high level, just to introduce the standard, ISO 45001 2018 replaces OSAS 18001 2007. And we talk about migration instead of transition because It's not a revision of the OSAS 18001 standard to 2018. This is a different standard. It's an ISO standard introducing the health and safety aspect of the standard and replacing OSAS 18001. So we use the term migration instead of transition since we're going from one standard to technically a completely different standard. The standard defines the requirements for establishing, implementing, and maintaining an occupational health and safety management system. And we use the acronym OHSMS for that. You'll see that throughout my slides, OHS or OHSMS, just to shorten the presentation. The standard represents a framework for an organization to be able to control its hazards, reduce the risk of things like accidents, injuries, ill health, and or downtime, and to be able to continually improve its processes and operations. That is an expectation within the standard that the organization will continually improve as well. The standard was published in March of 2018. It is a voluntary certification, meaning it's not required by any particular regulation or OSHA. This is optional. Certainly some standards require something similar as a prerequisite, but again, it is technically a voluntary certification. So I mentioned that this is a migration. There is a 3-year migration period in total for clients who are already certified to OSAS 18001-2007. So any existing OSAS 18001 certificates have already been revised to reflect the expiration date required by this migration process. This was extended for anyone who isn't already aware related to COVID-19 and difficulties in scheduling some audits and some facilities having to be actually shut down for a period of time, again, related to the pandemic. So we do have a new deadline there for clients that need that extension. PGR issued a transition plan based on the standards publication of March of 2018. In order to avoid a lapse in certification, in our transition plan, we communicated a deadline by which those migration audits should occur, or technically speaking, a date by which the migration audits must take place in order for PGR to guarantee no lapse in certification. So what this means is that once the audit is complete, we're not handing you a certificate that day. There are several activities that take place after the last day of the audit, including time for the organization to respond to any nonconformities that might have been issued by the auditor, submit appropriate corrective action plans, implement corrections, submit evidence to the auditor. The auditor has to review that information and that evidence and either accept it or send it back for revision or further changes. Once the auditor approves all of that and submits it to PJR, the package will then go through a review process internally within PJR. After the package has been approved to meet our internal accreditation requirements that PJR is subject to, the certificate will go to the certification department where they will put a draft certificate together, assuming you don't have any unpaid balances or outstanding, dues. And then you would get a draft certificate to approve, make sure everything is spelled correctly, your address is correct, all of that stuff, and send that back to us before a final official certificate is issued. So that final certificate issuance is what we are racing against the clock for. All of that needs to be done before the deadline. You have to have that final certificate issued before this overall expiration date for OSAS 18001 to not have a lapse. So if you don't have that certificate issued before the deadline, there's a period of time in which you're technically not certified. You can't advertise being certified to this health and safety standard. You'd have to remove, any logos or advertising from your website or things like that. And in some cases, that can cause an issue for an organization. So keep this in mind when you're scheduling your audits. We'll talk more about how these audits need to be scheduled on the next slide. I do want to note that migration audits can occur during surveillance or recertification audits. It doesn't have to be a recertification audit for you to migrate to ISO 45001. We do need to add at least one audit day for all of those transition and migration requirements to be audited, since there are so many changes in ISO 45001. So I put all of that information onto a timeline. Sometimes the visual representation is a little bit easier to understand. So we are no longer auditing to OSAS 18001 for new clients, okay? And we are conducting audits to ISO 45001 at this point in time. We did not change that date related to no longer auditing to OSAS 18001, even with the extension, because we are really trying to get everyone to migrate and not have a bottleneck or an issue scheduling those audits if everyone decides to wait, because of that extension. On a case-by-case basis, if we need to evaluate going beyond that June 1st of 2020 deadline that's already passed, we can consider that. So we set a deadline of December 1st of 2020 for all migration audits to occur to prevent a lapse in certification, for us to be able to guarantee no lapse in certification. And again, we haven't revised that date either, given the deadline extension. If we need to consider that on a case-by-case basis, we can do so. And if the audit goes after that, the difference would be no guarantee that we could meet that deadline without a lapse in certification. So keep that in mind. If you haven't already scheduled your migration, please reach out to your schedulers so that you guys can get the ball rolling there. Okay. So the ISO standards, if you're familiar with any other ISO standards, they follow the same structure, which helps them be able to be integrated. So we see that now ISO 45001, as I mentioned earlier, is an ISO standard. It was not previously, it was OSAS 18001. So we see in ISO 45001 this same structure. It's called the Annex SL structure. So the clauses or provisions, or however you want to refer to the structure of the standard, follow a very similar format. The names are exactly, if not very similar, so exactly the same or very similar to other ISO standards. For example, ISO 9001 or ISO 14001. There are also common terms between those ISO standards for, again, ease of integration, continuity between those standards. In many cases, clients have more than one standard that they are integrating. So some of these terms may look familiar to you guys. We're not going to go through those together today. You can certainly get a copy of the standard and get familiar with those terms if you're not already. ISO 45001 also has some changes to the Plan, Do, Check, Act model as it was in OSAS 18001. So I've got a copy of the new Plan, Do, Check, Act model for 45001 on this slide as well. It's also found within the standard. Again, comparing OSAS 18001 to ISO 45001, one of those key changes is the adoption of the ISO or Annex SL structure that I introduced a couple slides ago. ISO 45001 emphasizes leadership. In fact, it has its own clause in this ISO Annex SL structure, assigning specific responsibilities for those in leadership roles to promote health and safety management within the organization and to ensure the success of the system. A typo on there I'll have to fix after this, just making myself a quick note. Okay. ISO 45001 also calls for proactivity throughout the standard in several ways and in several places. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but that is a key change in ISO 45000 as well. So expanded expectations for organizations to protect the health and safety of both workers and interested parties, such as through hazard identification, risk assessment, operational controls. Like I said, this can be found in several places throughout the standard. There's also a focus on risk management, requiring the planning and determination of risk considering the positive and negative, both the positive and negative. So this would relate to risks and opportunities, which we will get to in a few slides, the identified issues, and the needs and expectations of interested parties. There's also a focus on achieving the intended outcomes. I have that underlined because it's a defined term within the standard. You'll want to become familiar with that term. ISO 45001 has an emphasis on objective measurement and change compared to OSAS 18001 as well. There's a shift in emphasis with regards to continual improvement from OSAS 18001, which focused on improving the management system, to ISO 45001, which focuses, which focuses on improving the health and safety performance of the organization. There are also changes to the communication and awareness requirements, including equal emphasis in ISO 45001 on both external and internal communications, which was not necessarily the case in OSAS 18001, as well as the separation of awareness from competency requirements. So there is two separate sections covering those two topics, and the criteria for awareness is more prescriptive in ISO 45001. Overall, there are fewer prescriptive requirements throughout the standard to give organizations more flexibility in how they meet the requirements of the standard, whatever works best for their organization whenever they have that flexibility to do so, including the term documented information, which is not new if you guys are familiar with ISO 9001 2015 or ISO 14001 2015. They also incorporated this documented information term, which replaces documents and records to reflect the use of modern recording media and the evolution of computer and cloud-based systems to provide the organization with greater level of flexibility to be able to determine when documented procedures are actually needed to ensure effective process control. So as auditors, we're going to be looking at the effectiveness of your controls. So wherever it's not requiring something be documented explicitly, you can make the determination for your organization about whether it needs to be documented or not. And we will be gauging the effectiveness of those controls to help assess whether, for example, a lack of a documented procedure is appropriate. ISO 45001 has increased prominence for occupational health and safety management within the organization's strategic planning process. Again, this sort of relates to being proactive as well as greater emphasis on leadership. So even the management of the health and safety system should be included in the strategic planning process. So again, putting greater emphasis on all of these items. ISO 45001 also introduces specific verbiage about management of change, having a management of change process and meeting those management of change requirements that was not expressly required in OSAS 18001. I've included some information about the terms in here. We're going to skip these slides in the interest of time, but the slides can be downloaded from PJR's website as well as a recording of today's webinar. So besides reviewing them within the standard itself, you can also double back to the slides to get more familiar with these terms. The only thing I do want to point out is I mentioned the intended outcomes earlier. So the intended outcomes is found within the OHSMS definition. The intended outcomes of the OHSMS are to prevent injury and ill health to workers and to provide a safe and healthy workplace. So you'll find the intended outcomes term throughout these slides, and it relates to the effectiveness of the system and its ability to achieve its intended outcomes. So if the system is effective, if the controls are effective, then the system will be preventing injury and ill health and providing a safe and healthy workplace. If it's not, then it's not as effective as it could be. So that's what we're talking about when we say intended outcomes. I'm going to skip through these. Okay, We'll go clause by clause, focusing only on the areas where there are significant change. I'm going to be skipping the rest. So we talked about intended outcomes. In terms of context of the organization, you need to determine both internal and external issues that are relevant to the OHSMS and its ability to achieve its intended outcomes. So if it's not affecting the system and it's not affecting its ability to achieve the intended outcomes that we just talked about, then it may not necessarily be an issue that gets determined as relevant. Similarly, the organization needs to understand the needs and expectations of workers and interested parties as part of 4.2. So determining those relevant interested parties is is the first step. You need to know who your interested parties are, and it's not just your employees. So you need to think outside of the box here, determine who those interested parties are, and then what, if any, their needs and expectations might be for each of those interested party groups, because some of those expectations or needs are going to translate into requirements of the management system. So you're kind of setting the framework here. Similarly, you're going to use the internal and external issues you've identified in 4.1 and the needs or expectations you've identified in 4.2. You're going to consider those at least when determining the scope. They don't necessarily all need to be included, but they do need to be taken into consideration to determine the scope of the management system. I mentioned that leadership has its own clause. So clause 5 focuses on leadership and worker participation. Top management has a lot more accountability in the newer ISO standards. So top management needs to take on responsibility for the effectiveness of the management system, how well it's integrated into other business processes, whether the resources allocated to the OHSMS are adequate or not, and the communication of the importance of conformance to the OHSMS. So it really is intended to be proactive and to really trickle down or flow down from top management, who is ultimately going to be accountable for whether the system is effective or not. The OHS policy needs to align with the organization's strategic direction, as well as achieve the system's intended outcomes. A change in ISO 45001 is that the policy now should also include a commitment to participation. So we've always had kind of a bulleted list in the standard of what needs to be included in the policy. That is still there, and the commitment to participation would be the key change to those inputs. You'll see in ISO 45001 that a management representative, that term, is no longer mentioned in the standard. Top management is allowed to delegate responsibility. So there might be a management representative anyway, or there might be a team who's responsible for some of those delegated items. However, top management is ultimately responsible and accountable. 5.4 focuses on participation and consultation, both of which are defined terms that you should become familiar with. And 5.4 houses specific and prescriptive items or criteria to be included in this process, such as methods for training, identifying and removing any obstacles to participation, such as fear of reprisal. It also emphasizes non-manager participation. Six point one covers risks and opportunities I mentioned earlier. This reflects the need to include both positive and negative potentials. So become familiar with those terms as well if you're not already. The organization needs to determine the risks and opportunities in order to ensure the intended outcomes can be achieved, that you are preventing undesired effects and continually improve. Risks and opportunities might relate to hazards, legal and other requirements, and the ability to achieve the intended outcomes. The hazard identification subclause is prescriptive and proactive, requiring consideration and thorough hazard identification, and it lists items to include. So some of these may be obvious and some may be commonly overlooked. People in the nearby area who could be affected by the organization, vice versa, people in the nearby area who are not controlled by the organization but could affect the intended outcomes of the management system, the work area, the way it's set up, the way equipment is designed, actual or proposed changes affecting the OHSMS. This is where the management of change will come in. Past incidents should be considered and factor in so that you're learning from those incidents and continually improving. And there are other items in the standard. This is just a couple examples. You need to have a process to assess risk and retain documented information as evidence. And similarly, you need to have a process to assess those opportunities relevant to the performance of the occupational health and safety management system. As always, you're required to have up-to-date determination of and access to applicable legal and other requirements. It's not enough to determine what those legal requirements are. You also have to understand and determine how those requirements apply to your organization. What does that mean your organization has to do? And how do those requirements affect those hazards and risks that you have identified or need to identify? Sometimes within those requirements and how they apply, there are also communication requirements to be pulled out and accounted for within your management system. And there's a note here that legal and other requirements can result in risks and opportunities in some cases. Action needs to be planned to address risks, opportunities, legal and other requirements, emergency situations, integration into the OHSMS, and evaluation of effectiveness. That's important to make changes or implement controls or plan actions and then circle back around and identify how you are going to confirm that they were effective or test the effectiveness and then have evidence of doing so. You want to make sure you're taking into account the hierarchy of controls, which in 45,001 can be found in 8.1.2, the contents of which have not changed. The hierarchy of controls is the same. We still have objective requirements. As I mentioned, there is increased focus on this performance. So not necessarily any significant changes to the objectives themselves. The planning to achieve the objectives is more specific. You got to make sure you've got documented information maintained as evidence of having determined all of these things. So this is something that was not as clear in OSAS 18,001. What actions or tasks are going to be required to achieve those objectives, for example? Who's responsible for them? What is the timeline or deadline or due dates? How frequently are you going to monitor the progress? When are you going to do that? How are you going to do that? What are the results? Things like that. Competency and awareness have two separate subclauses, as I mentioned. The organization needs to determine the competency requirements for workers that can affect the performance of the OHSMS and have documented information as evidence of that competency. If there is a gap between the competence level or requirements for a given job, then you need to also take action to close that gap and meet the competency requirements, and again, have evidence of those actions as well as evaluate the effectiveness of those actions. So if training is required to close that gap, make sure you've got records of that training as well as verification of effectiveness of those actions. So that training, was that training effective? How are you going to verify that? And make sure you have evidence to be able to show an auditor. 7.3, on the other hand, as I mentioned, is more specific or has additional criteria, a long list of things that you need to be making your employees aware of, including the real or potential ramifications of deviating from the OHSMS requirements. External communication is given greater emphasis in ISO 45001, equal emphasis to internal communication. That's a change in ISO 45001. So you need to go through the process of determining those internal and external information or communication requirements. Specifically, who needs to be notified when, what is the preferred format, or how will you complete that communication. All of that needs to be determined, which means we need to be able to see evidence of that determination having been completed. External interested party views, when relevant, should also be considered here. So in some cases, they may have your interested parties may have requirements about how they want to be contacted or for what. Documented information, I mentioned already this new term. So 7.5 outlines the specific controls for documented information. Similar to document controls and record controls, we're thinking along the lines of how the documented information is created, how it's updated, how it's controlled, all that good stuff. It has a new name. Clause 8 focuses on operation. Again, we need documented information sufficient to show evidence of meeting the requirements. So in this case, we're talking about having established process criteria for the actions that you have planned, the operational controls, sufficient to make sure those process criteria are being met. I mentioned there are no significant changes to the hierarchy of controls. And I also mentioned that one of the key changes in ISO 45001 is the introduction and strong language around the concept of management of change. So ISO 45001 specifically requires a process for controlling planned changes that could affect the occupational health and safety performance of the organization, as well as to review and mitigate any negative impacts of inadvertent changes. Some examples for this, or the intent, what will kick off this management of process or trigger this management of change: new products, new services or processes, changes to working conditions, changes to equipment, changes to applicable legal and other requirements. So are you swapping out one piece of equipment for another? Are you removing a piece of equipment and outsourcing a process? Are you adding a third shift? Are you adding a new product line? Things like that. So that you can evaluate the potential impact of those changes to plan accordingly, so that you're not implementing a change and then realizing after the fact that it affected the OHSMS in a variety of ways: PPE, training, introducing new hazards, changing the risk level of existing hazards, things like that. And that is a big part of the tone of proactivity that I mentioned earlier. There are requirements for outsourcing found in 8.1.4, covered under procurement. So there's a couple different subclauses here. We see requirements for controlling the activities of contractors, and this works both ways. Your organization can be having an impact on the contractors, and the contractors' activities can be having an impact on your organization. So keep that in mind as well. 8.1.4.2 requires criteria for contractor selection be identified, and that there need to be processes in place to ensure the contractor's activities meet those requirements. There are requirements for controlling outsourcing, so procured materials or services need to also meet the requirements of the OHSMS. 8.2 covers emergency preparedness and response. No significant changes here, but there are additional items to be considered and possibly included in an emergency response process. And I've included those here as examples. Again, not a significant change, but in regards to monitoring and measurement, you need to be able to show you have specifically determined the who, the when, the how, of those monitoring and measurement requirements or expectations to go ahead and evaluate the requirements there. So keep that in mind in terms of your documented information. How can you show that you've determined those? The internal audit requirements identify specific factors to be determined within the audit program. It also requires the results of the internal audit be reported to relevant managers, workers and/or representatives, and any other relevant interested parties. Management review has some additional or revised inputs and outputs to take a look at in section 9.3, and those reviews need to be performed by top management. Again, there is a lot of responsibility and accountability for the leadership team, and management review is a really important tool to utilize. So it's important that they are involved and aware of what's going on. Clause 10 in ISO 45001 adds opportunities for improvement, which again echoes the proactivity requirements I mentioned, or tone of proactivity, as well as reintroducing a term that was removed in some of the other ISO standards. 10.2 covers incidents, nonconformities, and corrective actions. It requires timely action to address and correct incidents and nonconformities. Again, we're being proactive here. We're not sitting around taking a long time to investigate things. In the meantime, another similar incident could occur. So this is really important, and stronger language in ISO 45001 than in OSAS 18001. Corrective actions also need to be reviewed for effectiveness and have evidence. So again, we're thinking documented information here. 10.2 also requires the results to be reported to relevant workers and/or representatives and interested parties as relevant. So similar to the results of internal audits, we should have some good communication here when it comes to incidents, nonconformities, and corrective actions as well. 10.3 covers continual improvement. No earth-shattering changes here. But again, the emphasis is on improving the occupational health and safety performance of the organization instead of just improving the management system itself. ISO 45001 has an annex at the end for organizations to get some guidance on how to use the standard, and a bibliography, neither of which we are going to spend time on today. I mentioned that in conjunction with or around the same time that ISO 45001 was published, there were also some other changes that affect health and safety certified clients. We're going to talk about IAF Mandatory Document 21 and IAF Mandatory Document 22. So these can be found online. Primarily, these are requirements for certification bodies such as PJR, but in many cases, the requirements within them trickle down to our clients because there are accreditation requirements that we need to meet as a registrar, and often that affects the audit process or the audit contents or the quoting process, contract requirements, things like that. So there were a couple of requirements that I felt specifically trickled down to clients and were worth mentioning while I have you guys here on the webinar. So the IAF mandatory documents 21 and 22 overall raise the bar of performance expectations for the occupational health and safety management system, which I think we can agree ISO 45001 raises the bar as well. It increases some of the requirements. It has a distinct tone of proactivity required throughout it, leadership accountability, that really raises the bar. And these documents echo that sentiment, maybe even raising the bar further. So one of the requirements is to notify PJR or your certification body of significant change in writing as soon as possible. So you can take a look at the term significant change, but essentially what we need to avoid is situations where the client organization waits until the auditor gets on site for their next audit to bring up some of the changes that have occurred since they were there last, or an auditor was there last. And in some cases, it's not a big deal, but these significant changes typically affect a lot of things, including audit time calculations. So when we need to scramble to make those changes after the audit has already started, or the auditor, has already traveled to the site, this can be really challenging. It can be expensive for the client. Having to change travel is not an easy thing. And by then, the auditor may not be able to accommodate changes to the audit due to their schedule constraints. They may not be available to tack a day on to the end of your audit. They may have another commitment. So this is written into these IAF mandatory documents because there are a lot of moving parts internally within the certification body that rely on your prompt communication of significant changes to your registrar. So keep that in mind. The IAF mandatory documents also refer to or introduce a prescribed audit timetable, which is calculated using several factors, including risk level and employee count. So, for example, if you have a change in employee count or changes to your processes that we use to determine your risk level, those would be examples of significant changes that, again, really should not be waiting until your audit to be brought up. So I wanted to mention that, as well as the fact that we are required as a registrar to follow this audit timetable. We don't create our own. So the idea would be that certification bodies are quoting about the same because we're all held to the same audit timetable. We don't just come up with our own numbers. I mentioned throughout the presentation that top management accountability is really emphasized throughout the standard. The IEF mandatory documents introduce a requirement related to top management that we need to record as auditors if top management is not present during the closing meeting. And if they're not present during the closing meeting, we have to note their reason for not being there. And it has to be a good excuse. So our auditors have to document if top management is not in attendance, why they're not there. And down the road, this could be an issue for your certification standing if top management is not demonstrating this involvement and accountability. The closing meeting for the third party audit is arguably one of the most important parts, if not the most important part of the audit, to go over the entirety of the audit, how it went, the strengths and weaknesses of the system, any nonconformities that were identified, and any actions needed related to those, the standing of the certification, and any follow-up action needed. So we need to see that top management is demonstrating their involvement and accountability by being present for the closing meeting. And you're usually not having your audit scheduled a week before it takes place. So use this information to try and schedule your audit at a time when top management can be available, and then ensure that they'll be involved, or they should be ensuring that they'll be involved and available. Personnel responsible for monitoring employee health, such as doctors or nurses, are to be available for interview during ISO 45001 audits. So this is a change, again, stronger language than OSAS 18001, but if they're involved in that monitoring, they are expected to be sampled and interviewed, and part of the audit process. So again, take the scheduling into consideration for your audit and make sure that this can be accommodated. Certification bodies may conduct special audits in response to compliance issues, incidents, etc., and it can even lead to suspension or withdrawal of certification. This is already in our terms and conditions, but I wanted you to understand where some of these requirements come from. So especially with health and safety, if you have, for example, a significant OSHA compliance issue, it could potentially impact your ability to maintain your certification to ISO 45001, excuse me. Legal compliance violations or gaps may prevent or impede initial certification. So similar to the previous bullet point, again, if you are already having issues like that, we may put a hold on issuing a certificate to understand how those compliance issues are resolved, how they're closed out, if they're accepted by OSHA, or kind of follow that process to completion before we go ahead and issue a certificate. So it's really a case by case basis. I can't say we encounter this too often, but again, this is where some of those requirements are coming from for us as a registrar or a certification body. Okay, so really quick before we close with some questions, I want to go through the certification process for anyone who is not migrating from OSAS 18001 to ISO 45001, but is instead pursuing certification for the first time, or maybe discontinued their health and safety certification for a while and are now circling back to getting certified to that again. So the first step would be to, and I don't have it on this slide, but the first step is definitely always to obtain a copy of the standard. So you can do that from the ISO website. And once you have a copy of that standard, then you will establish the health and safety system documentation to meet the requirements of the standard. You'll perform or administer any training that's required to meet those management system requirements that you have identified in the first bullet point. Then you move on to implementing those management system requirements, which include conducting an internal audit of the entire system, conducting a compliance evaluation, and conducting a management review of the system and its effectiveness, including the outputs of the internal audit as an input. So make sure the internal audit takes place before the management review. So before you can have a stage 1 and stage 2 audit be successfully completed, which we'll talk about in a moment, to be able to achieve certification, you're going to need a full internal audit, a compliance evaluation, and a full system review. You'll also need a contract with a certification body such as PGR to conduct your audits. And I can provide contact information on our last slide. You will then have your stage 1 and stage 2 audits, which I'll detail in a moment, addressing any resulting nonconformities if there were any before a certificate can be issued. And I did mention that earlier as well regarding the migration process. So the stage 1 and stage 2 audit are what constitute the registration process or the certification process. The stage 1 audit is a documentation review to make sure the framework is in place, that the documentation framework, or maybe not necessarily documentation, because again, we have this more flexible definition of documented information, but that the framework is in place for the organization to be able to meet the requirements of the standard. They've taken the standard requirements into consideration and determined how they're going to go ahead and meet those requirements. It also evaluates the organization's readiness to move on to stage 2. The stage 2 audit is an audit of the entire management system, including sampling of all shifts and processes to assess whether those requirements or the framework from stage 1 has been effectively implemented to meet the requirements of the standard. The stage 2 audit could potentially result in nonconformities, which do need to be resolved before a certificate can be issued. Once a certificate is issued, you are on a 3-year cycle. The certificate is good for 3 years. So following the stage 2 audit, you've got 2 years of surveillance audits, which could be annual or semi-annual, depending on your contract and your preference. And those represent partial system audits. So not necessarily all of the processes, all of the shifts, but a sampling, roughly half. Although there are certain processes that get audited every year, such as internal audits and the corrective action process. The third year of that 3-year cycle represents the recertification audit, which in for all intents and purposes is exactly the same as the stage 2. It covers all of the processes, all of the shifts are again sampled, any nonconformities need to be resolved, and the end result is hopefully a new certificate, which is good for 3 years and starts the cycle all over. In some cases, we have integrated um, audits, integrated management systems. If you have, for example, ISO 14001, um, and you are looking to have your audits be conducted at the same time, as long as you have a truly an integrated system, such as those standards being um, audited internally at the same time, one management review, things like that, we can, in many cases, provide integration discounts and conduct those audits at the same time. Okay, that was the last slide I have. So if you haven't already done so, go ahead and type your questions in. And in the meantime, I'm going to put our contact information up on the screen for everyone to see. So my name again is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. I can be contacted by calling the main PJR number and they could put you through to my extension, or by email. I prefer email, especially if you have technical questions, and then we can go ahead and schedule a phone call if that makes sense. Our program manager, Stacy DeSantis, is also available through phone and email. And I've included a phone number for our sales department as well if you are a new or transfer client and you are looking for some quote information. You can contact sales at that number. Okay, let's see. Okay, so we have a question here. It says, given the pandemic, what is PJR's position on remote auditing of clients via the internet, the effect on recertification, and when must an on-site audit be completed during the recertification process? Okay, that's a great question. So if you have an audit scheduled um, in the upcoming months, if you haven't already reached out to your scheduler, I would encourage you to do so. We are evaluating each client on a case-by-case basis based on when their audit is scheduled and the audit type as to whether or not they are a good candidate for virtual audits. It is something that we are able to do, including recertification audits and including this migration from OSAS 18001 to ISO 45001. So potentially that audit can be conducted virtually. We have a form that we utilize to screen each client. Your scheduler can send it to you, have you fill it out and send it back to understand whether your system is a good candidate for virtual auditing. That would get reviewed by, in this case, the EHS department, and usually it would be reviewed by me to, again, make a case-by-case determination on whether an audit can be switched from an on-site audit to a virtual audit based on the contents of the form and some other things that we take into consideration. So that's a little bit about our remote auditing. I can't speak for some of the other departments, but for the EHS standard, we are, again, considering all of those on a case-by-case basis. There are some other standards that have specific constraints about what can and cannot be done virtually. ISO 45001 is not currently one of those. So we are capable of doing the the migration audit and or a recertification audit for ISO 45001 virtually if the client is a good candidate for virtual auditing. So again, reach out to your scheduler for that form if you want to be considered for an upcoming audit to be changed to virtual if your scheduler has not already proactively reached out to you about that, which I know they have tried to do to the best of their ability. In terms of an on-site audit, if the audit is approved to go completely virtual, there is not an on-site component that needs to then be completed in order for the recertification audit to be completed. In the case of ISO 45001, again, assuming the client is a good candidate, the entire migration audit, the entire recertification audit, however you fall in your cycle, can be completely virtual. It can be up to 100% virtual, and then there wouldn't be an on-site component. If the client is not a candidate for an entirely virtual audit, maybe we can have some of the audit time go virtual, and the balance would need to be conducted on site before the end of the year to meet those annual auditing requirements. Again, this is really considered on a case-by-case basis. So if that answer is not specific enough, I would encourage you to reach out to me and or your scheduler, so that we can take a close look at your specific situation, and get that ironed out for you. Okay, thanks, Mark. Okay, another question. Could you please explain the technique of performance evaluation? I want to make sure I understand. Maybe I'll go back in the slides to see where we covered performance evaluation. So we're looking at the same thing. Hold on one second. Okay. Okay. I'm not seeing exactly where we talked about performance evaluation specifically. So maybe you could send me an email and we could talk about that in more detail offline. I want to make sure I can answer your question, but I don't want to hold everybody else up. Okay. Another question, could you give us an example for clause 10? There's a couple of requirements in clause 10. So again, that's not super specific. We're covering improvement, so identifying opportunities for improvement, which related to clause 9, where you are conducting your internal audit and you're conducting your monitoring and measurement for performance evaluation. Maybe that's where you were talking about. This really varies by industry, and the specific processes and activities going on at the facility. This is really site specific, what monitoring might be required. In some cases, there's noise concerns and monitoring related to noise levels, for example. So that's really specific to an organization. Regarding clause 10, again, we're covering opportunities for improvement here. We're covering incidents, nonconformities, corrective actions, and then we're also covering just the general concept of continual improvement. So again, if you could email me or be more specific, that I can try and answer your question. Okay, and then the last question, what is the most dangerous situation do you meet during auditing? That varies by auditor and industry as well. And I'm not sure if you mean as an auditor, what's the most dangerous I've been in, or, the most significant hazards we encounter. And again, it varies so much by industry. So maybe a phone call to answer your questions or an email would be best. I'd be glad to talk about this more. Yes, monitoring can also be related to KPIs. It can be related to permit requirements you might have. It can be related to legal and other requirements. Some things just off the top of my head, forklift requirements to check all of the safety features are working and the maintenance is maintained, calibration requirements, safety harness monitoring and checks, any KPIs that you might have, of course. There's so many things and it varies by industry. So we can walk through that in more detail depending on your organization's scope and things like that. Okay, I can hang out for another minute if we have any other questions. I'm going to go back to the contact information slide. Okay, I think that's all we have. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you've already migrated, I hope that was successful. If you have an upcoming migration audit, I wish you luck. We offer the webinars every couple of months, so feel free to tune back in if you haven't migrated yet or review those past recordings. And again, the slides will be made available on PGR's website as well as a recording of today's webinar. You're welcome. Okay, so with that, I will close. Thank you again for joining us and have a great day.